So generally speaking, every time we look at this in the built environment, and I mean every time, anywhere in the world, particularly in places like the UK and Europe, we find massive non-compliance with even doing the basics right, because it's a silent killer. I know you've spoken about things like Grenfell on this show. That's a dramatic response. You know, things catching on fire, people dying, stuff falling on them, you know, those kinds of things elicit a response, and rightly so. The challenge with air quality is this long-term esoteric risk, this thing that we can mentally kick into the long grass. You know, I joke often with people that ventilation doesn't leak and drown a building and cause physical damage like plumbing does. It's not like electrics. It doesn't spark and cause a flame and burn a building down. You get ventilation wrong, nobody knows anything about it for 65 years until you end up with lung cancer or dementia or something else from an accumulative exposure to pollutant. That's the challenge. Outside of things like carbon monoxide poisoning and things that have an immediate response, the challenge we have is that this critical pillar of the built environment, which is ventilation, is something that nobody's paid much attention to. And no more so was that brought home than during the COVID pandemic. As Kath Noakes, who was one of the prominent voices in the UK, she was part of SAGE and the teams that were looking at how to manage the risk of COVID in the built environment. One of the things she's on record as saying was that what COVID asked us was much less about what is the current impact of our buildings on our exposure to COVID. It was asking us the fundamental question of what do we even know about the performance of our buildings? And the answer to that was sweet F all. We just don't know. We don't know how our classes are ventilating. We don't know how our hospitals are ventilating, our offices, our homes. And every time anybody looks in any way whatsoever, we don't like what we see. So unfortunately, that's the starting point of our conversation here in a lot of ways, is like, where are we? The result is not in a good spot, actually, when it comes to ventilation.
So since we spend so much time in buildings, you've mentioned 55 years if I live to 80. What is it that I can do now from listening to you? What action can I take to have a better understanding of the air quality of the buildings that I'm in frequently? And then after that, what action can I take?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's a couple of answers to that. The first one is awareness. You know, once we start thinking about this and recognizing the problem for what it is, we can start to view it in a better way. So that's the first thing, is to get educated on why this might be important to you. Because a lot of the things that we've assumed might be something else might actually be ventilation. Those recurring illnesses you get, that asthma that your kid's starting to develop, those allergic reactions you're starting to get, those chronic illnesses may very well be your exposure to air pollution and not what you thought it was.
So there's a connection between eczema, asthma to air quality?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and everything else. But we don't, as somebody said to me the other day, the challenge you have in the medical community, and like everybody experiences this, we tend to build up a list by the time we go to the GPs, right? Because
Of ourselves, you mean?
Because when we finally get a GP's appointment and it costs us money, usually there's something fairly serious going on before we go there. And you only get 5-10 minutes to talk about what you're happening. Now, the GP is going to be really interested in the stuff that might be associated with you dropping dead and, you know, blood pressure and heart attacks and things like that. And we very rarely get down to the bottom of the list of general ailments that we have, that if we tied those together might actually build a picture that goes, why isn't this a good story for your home environment or your work environment? Are the things I'm seeing as a GP actually a symptom of exposure to environmental pollution in some way, exposure to mold, exposure to chemicals, something? But we very rarely get to have that conversation actually with GPs. So the more awareness, the better. The second big thing that we can do is recognize that just because a standard exists doesn't mean that we've got what we've paid for. So understanding that the ventilation systems that we have in our built environment, there's a higher chance than not that they're not doing what they should do. So how do we check that? How do I in my home? How do I in my office? When was the last time your listeners were in your office and you saw anybody going around maintaining or checking the flow rates of the ventilation ventilation system in your office.
Yeah, I've never seen that.
Chances are somebody's been round and done the air conditioning systems, right? Checked the F-gas and all that kind of stuff and cleaned out the aircon. But most people will never have seen anybody go round an office actually making sure you're getting the fresh air that you need, right? So we need to start thinking in terms of that this is an important pillar of performance of buildings that has an impact on our health. How do I know we're getting what we paid for? Because most of us are paying for this in one way or the other. We either bought a house or we're paying rent or leasing an office space or whatever. We're paying for adequate ventilation, and I'm sitting here today telling you there's a higher chance than not that you're not getting it. So it's a big swindle, really, and this is something you're supposed to have got. So somebody's not doing what they're supposed to have done. So often this isn't a cost that you even have to bear. It just needs to be important enough that somebody checks it. And the third thing, and this is where the built environment is going much more generally, is that we're able to see the performance of the spaces we occupy in ways that we've never been able to before. You could have an air quality monitor in this room with a nice screen on it telling you exactly how the air quality is. We weren't able to do that really 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So we're in a position now where there's no excuses really. We can see the quality of the air, generally speaking, in every space that we occupy. And if the built environment recognises that probably within the decade, maybe even less, there won't be many spaces that we're in where there isn't some form of environmental monitoring happening. And that changes the narrative and has impacts all the way down the supply chain, because you will live and die and be judged, and your brand reputation will be based on the ongoing performances of the spaces that you design and construct and manage. It won't be about whether you complied with regulations when it was built or not, and you can blame somebody downstream who didn't do their job.
Yeah, because no one will care, because you're seeing the information.
You will see. It's as simple as that. In the same way we see with cars, we have information coming at us from cars that tell us how they're performing, what the real world performance is. You'll find tables popping up of good air quality in schools and poor air quality in schools, because we know schools has an impact on scores. These kind of, that's the world we're looking into, because this technology, this connected world of IoT and sensors is here now. And there are very good ways of us understanding the performance of those spaces. And that changes the narrative.